The candles were still sitting in their plastic box on my kitchen counter when I heard my son laugh from the other room and ask, "Wait, whose birthday is it again?" I stood frozen in the hallway of my own house, holding a cake I had bought for myself 3 hours earlier, and I felt something in my chest go very, very still. 45 years old, and my own family had forgotten I existed. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because it's not the kind of pain that announces itself loudly. It doesn't scream. It doesn't shatter glass or slam doors. It just settles into your bones quietly, the way cold settles into an empty house. And you don't even notice how deep it's gotten until you're standing in a hallway at 45 years old, holding a cake with no name written on it, listening to the people who are supposed to love you most talk about chemistry homework like it's the most important thing in the world. My name is Eleanor Hayes. Everyone calls me Ellie. And that October evening started exactly the way the last 5 birthdays had started. Quietly, invisibly, and completely alone in a house full of people. I had told myself for years that it didn't matter, that birthdays were just numbers on a calendar, that real love doesn't need a date circled in red to prove itself. I had gotten very good at telling myself that lie, but standing in that hallway, watching my husband Mark scroll through his phone without glancing up, listening to my daughter Sophie complain about a chemistry test, something inside me finally cracked. And I didn't have a name for the feeling that came pouring out of that crack. I set the cake down on the counter without a word. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked why there was a cake sitting there with no candles lit, no name written in icing, nothing. I climbed the stairs slowly, sat on the edge of my bed, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself cry. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying you see in movies, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep, you almost don't recognize it as your own grief. If your chest is already tightening a little, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you, what happened 3 days later changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about my family. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why I couldn't sleep for a week straight. My name is on this channel because I believe every ordinary life holds an extraordinary story underneath it, and mine was only just beginning to reveal itself. This is Legacy Whisper. Stay with me until the end, because you will not see where this goes. To really understand what happened to me, you need to go back further, back to who I was before that hallway, before that cake. Before any of this began, I was the middle child of 3. My older brother Daniel was the golden child, the one who could seemingly do no wrong in our father's eyes, no matter how many times he actually did something wrong. My younger sister Rachel was the baby of the family, doted on, protected, forgiven for everything. And me, I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who brought home straight A's and never caused a single problem, and still, somehow, felt like a ghost at my own family's dinner table. My father, Richard Hayes, built a manufacturing business in Ohio from absolutely nothing. He started with a single rented warehouse and a loan he could barely afford, and by the time I was in college, that company employed almost 200 people. He wore his own hard-earned success like armor, and he expected every single one of us to wear that same armor, whether we wanted it or not. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was just immovable, and immovable men have a way of crushing the people standing too close to them without ever meaning to. When I was 22, I fell in love with a man my father did not approve of. Mark was a public school teacher, kind, steady, completely uninterested in money or status, which in my father's world made him practically worthless. I still remember the Thanksgiving dinner where my father stood up from the table, looked directly at me in front of the entire extended family, and said that if I married Mark, I would be doing it without a single cent of his blessing, and without a place at his table ever again. I married Mark anyway. 6 months later, quietly, without a single phone call announcing it, and true to his word, my father erased me. Not with some dramatic, movie-worthy scene. He simply stopped calling, stopped inviting me to holidays, and my siblings, desperate to keep their place in his good graces, followed his lead without so much as a backward glance, until birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sunday phone calls, all quietly. methodically disappeared from my life like a slow leak. You don't notice until the tire is already flat. I told myself I didn't need them. Mark and I built a good life together in a modest house 2 states away. We had 2 children, Sophie, now 17, sharp-tongued and fiercely loyal, and Caleb, 14, quiet like I used to be. I told myself, over and over, for 15 years, that I was happy, that I didn't need my father's approval or my siblings' company. I had gotten so good at that lie that I almost believed it myself. But grief doesn't disappear just because you refuse to look at it. It hides inside your routines. It waits. And it chooses the cruelest possible moments to surface. Like 3 days after my own family forgot my 45th birthday, when a black car I did not recognize pulled slowly into my driveway, and a man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out, holding a leather folder pressed against his chest like it contained something dangerous. He introduced himself as Anthony Reyes, an attorney representing the estate of Richard Hayes, my father, who I had not spoken to in almost 15 years. My father, who I would learn in the next 30 seconds had died 11 days earlier, alone in his house in Ohio, and none of my siblings had bothered to tell me. I remember, the ground actually seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Mr. Reyes must have seen the blood drain out of my face, because his voice softened immediately. Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry. I assumed you already knew. I didn't know. I hadn't known he was sick. I hadn't known he was gone. And underneath the grief that hit me like a wave, something colder and sharper began to rise to the surface. The unmistakable, creeping sense that something was being deliberately kept from me. Something my own family did not want me to find out. I let him inside. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the very same table where, 3 days earlier, my family had forgotten I turned 45, and he opened that leather folder with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had delivered devastating news more times than he could count. Your father revised his will 4 months before he passed, he said carefully, and there are irregularities, things I believe you deserve to know before the rest of your family finds out I've come to see you. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them flat against the table. Irregularities. That word sat in the air between us like smoke curling off a fire I couldn't yet see, but could already smell. He explained that my father's estate, the business, the house, decades of careful investments had been divided evenly among the 3 of us in every version of his will for over 20 years. But 4 months before his death, my father had quietly gone to a different attorney, alone, telling no one, and rewritten the entire document. Mr. Reyes had only recently inherited the file after the original attorney retired, and something about the new paperwork had troubled him enough that he chose to drive 4 hours to find me in person, rather than simply mailing a standard notice, like protocol required. Your brother and sister have already filed a motion to contest the new will, he said, watching my face carefully. They're claiming your father wasn't of sound mind when he signed it. But Mrs. Hayes, I've reviewed his medical records myself. I've spoken with his physician directly. Your father was lucid, sharp, completely aware of exactly what he was doing, right up until the final weeks of his life. The careful way he chose each word told me he was preparing me for something much bigger than a simple inheritance dispute. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake beside Mark, replaying every version of my childhood I could remember, searching desperately for some clue I had missed. Why would a man who cut me off completely rewrite his will in total secrecy, 4 months before he died? Why were Daniel and Rachel fighting so hard, so fast, to stop it? And why, after 15 years of complete silence, had my father apparently thought of me at the very end, and only at the very end? The answers arrived faster than I expected, and they were far uglier than anything I could have imagined lying awake in that dark bedroom. 2 days later, my phone rang, and Rachel's name appeared on the screen for the first time in over a decade. Her voice came through syrupy, sweet, the exact same tone that used to make my skin crawl even when we were children sharing a bedroom. Ellie, sweetie, I'm so relieved you finally know. Listen, this whole situation is such a mess. Dad really wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. You understand, right? We should really just settle this quietly, as a family, keep the lawyers out of it. I asked her, very evenly, why she hadn't bothered to tell me our father had died. There was a long silence on the line before she finally said, "We didn't think you'd want to know." That single sentence told me everything and absolutely nothing at the same time. Because the real truth, the truth Rachel clearly didn't want surfacing, was still buried somewhere beneath 15 years of silence. And I could feel it pressing hard against the surface, aching to break through. 3 nights later, something happened that I still can't fully explain. And it's the moment this story stopped being simply painful and started becoming something closer to frightening. I was driving home from the grocery store around 9 at night, taking the same back road I'd taken 1,000 times before. About half a mile from my house, I noticed headlights behind me, too close, too steady, matching every turn I made with an unnatural precision. I told myself it was nothing, coincidence. But when I pulled into my own driveway and the car slowed almost to a stop at the end of my street, before finally continuing on, my hands were trembling so hard I had to sit in my car for a full 5 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I didn't tell Mark that night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief and shock were playing tricks on my nerves. But 2 days after that, I found something in my mailbox that made my blood run cold. A single sheet of paper, no envelope, no return address, with 6 typed words: "Drop the will. For your family's sake." I stood on my own front porch, holding that piece of paper, staring at my quiet suburban street, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't simply a family falling apart over money. Someone was actively, deliberately trying to frighten me into silence, and I had absolutely no idea how far they were willing to go to make that happen. I brought the note straight to Mr. Reyes the next morning, and his reaction confirmed exactly what I feared. His expression darkened as he examined it, turning it over carefully in his gloved hands, before slipping it into an evidence bag. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. This is no longer just a probate dispute. I want you to consider having a security system installed. I want you to vary your routine. And I want you to let me finish explaining what I found in your father's will, because I believe it explains exactly why someone is frightened enough to send you this." What he told me next reshaped the entire foundation of everything I believed about my family, my father, and the 15 years of silence I had carried like a stone in my chest. In the final, secret version of his will, my father had left the majority of his estate, 60% of everything he owned, not to Daniel, and not to Rachel, but to me. The remainder was split between my siblings, with a smaller trust established for my children's education. But it wasn't the money that stopped my breathing. It was the letter attached to the will, written in my father's unmistakable, slanted handwriting, meant to be read only after his death. In it, he confessed something he had buried for 15 years. Shortly after I married Mark, Daniel had come to him with a carefully constructed lie claiming that I had been quietly stealing money from the family business in the years before I left home. My father, already furious about my marriage, had believed him instantly, using the accusation as justification to erase me completely, telling himself it was about principle, when really, it had always been about believing the absolute worst of the daughter who dared to defy him. But 3 years before his death, my father discovered the truth. It was Daniel, not me, who had been quietly siphoning money from the company for years, drowning in gambling debts he desperately needed to hide. My father found old records, bank statements, and eventually former bookkeeper who, racked with guilt after all those years, finally told him everything, rather than confront Daniel outright and shatter what remained of his family in one violent conversation. My father spent his final years quietly gathering proof, quietly grieving the daughter he had wrongfully exiled, and quietly planning to make it right, the only way a proud, stubborn man like him knew how: through a will, and through a letter he desperately hoped I would someday actually read. "I was a coward, Ellie," the letter said. "I chose comfortable lies over difficult truths for far too long, and I let you pay a price you never deserved to pay. This will is not charity, it is justice. 15 years too late. I'm sorry does not begin to cover what I owe you, but it is the only thing I have left to give. I read that letter 3 times before I could breathe normally again. 15 years of believing I had been unwanted, unloved, discarded for choosing my own happiness. And the truth was that I had been the victim of my own brother's lie, protected by my father's guilty silence, and now, finally, vindicated by his last act of honesty on this earth. But vindication, I would very quickly learn, comes with its own dangers. And Daniel had no intention of letting that truth surface quietly. 4 nights after the note appeared in my mailbox, I woke up at nearly 3 in the morning to the sound of my car alarm screaming through the darkness. Mark was already halfway down the stairs by the time I made it to the window, and what we found in the driveway made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Both of my front tires slashed clean through, and across the hood, scratched deep into the paint. 3 words. Last warning, Ellie. Called the police that night. Shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask me twice to repeat my address. They filed a report. They dusted for prints. They never found. And Mr. Reyes, when I called him at 6 the next morning, went completely silent on the phone for a long moment before saying the words that finally made the entire nightmare make sense. Ellie, I need to tell you something. I only just confirmed yesterday. Your brother's debts aren't simply credit card debt or bank loans. He owes a significant amount of money to people who do not forgive missed payments. I believe the inheritance isn't just about greed for him anymore. I believe, for Daniel, this has become a matter of survival. Rachel, I discovered shortly after, had known about Daniel's gambling problem for years and had been quietly helping him cover it, terrified of what the truth would do to the family's reputation if it ever came out. Her sudden sweetness on the phone hadn't been an attempt at reconciliation at all. It had been an attempt at damage control, dressed up in a decade-old nickname and a voice full of false warmth. 3 weeks into the contested will proceedings, Daniel showed up at my house completely unannounced, and the man standing on my porch that evening was almost unrecognizable from the composed, successful older brother I remembered from childhood. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he gripped the porch railing like it was the only thing holding him upright. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to drop this, Ellie," he said, his voice cracking with something that sounded less like anger and more like pure panic. "You don't understand what's happening. If I don't get access to that money, there are people, Ellie, there are people who don't care that I'm your brother. They will come after everything I have. My house, my family. And if you keep fighting this, I swear to God, it's not just going to be my problem anymore." I stood in my own doorway, staring at a man I had once idolized as a child, now unraveling in front of me, and I felt something strange happen inside my chest. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a deep, aching pity, tangled up with the fear I couldn't shake. "Was it you?" I asked quietly. "The note, the car, was that you, Daniel?" His silence lasted just a fraction of a second too long before he said, "I don't know what you're talking about," and turned and walked back to his car without another word. I called Mr. Reyes immediately, my hands still shaking as I relayed every detail. He arranged for a private security consultant to review my home, install cameras at every entrance, and walk Mark and me through basic safety protocols we never imagined we'd need in our own quiet neighborhood. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I finally felt like someone besides me was taking the danger seriously. The courtroom, when it finally came, felt like stepping into a completely different universe from the quiet suburban life I had built for 15 years. I sat beside Mr. Reyes at a long wooden table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching Daniel's attorney attempt, desperately and unconvincingly, to paint our father as a confused, manipulated old man who hadn't understood what he was signing in his final months. But Mr. Reyes was more than prepared. He presented the bank records my father had painstakingly gathered over 3 years. He presented the former bookkeeper's sworn, notarized testimony. He presented medical evaluations proving beyond any reasonable doubt that my father had remained mentally sharp until his final days. And when Daniel was finally called to the stand and pressed on the exact dates and amounts of the missing company funds, his composure shattered completely in front of the entire courtroom. He didn't confess outright. He didn't have to. His stammering, contradictory, increasingly desperate answers told the judge and everyone else in that room everything the documents had already proven beyond doubt. Then came the moment I will never forget as long as I live. During a recess, while Daniel sat slumped at the defense table with his head in his hands, a man I had never seen before walked calmly into the courtroom, exchanged a few quiet words with the court officer, and was escorted out just as calmly. Mr. Reyes leaned over and murmured, "That's a detective. He's been building a separate case against your brother for weeks. Unrelated debts, threats made to at least one other person besides you. Ellie, I think you should know. You may not be the only person he's frightened these past few months." The will was upheld in full. Every provision, every dollar, exactly as my father had written it in his final honest act on this earth. I won't pretend that moment felt like the kind of clean, satisfying victory you see in movies. It felt heavier than that, sadder than that, because winning meant finally confirming that my own brother had let me carry a lie for 15 years. That broke something inside me I still don't think has fully healed, even now. It meant confirming that Daniel, in his desperation, had been willing to frighten his own sister, slash her tires, leave threatening notes, possibly even follow her down a dark road at night, just to protect a secret that had been eating him alive for over a decade. And it meant confirming that my sister had chosen silence and comfort over honesty and courage. For the entire 15 years, I quietly mourned a relationship with my father that I believed. Until 3 weeks earlier, I had destroyed all by myself. But it also meant something else entirely, something that took me months afterward to fully understand and accept. Somewhere in his final years, alone in that big, empty house in Ohio, my father had finally found a courage I had spent 15 years wishing he'd found so much sooner. He looked directly at his own mistakes, and for the first time in his entire proud, stubborn life, refused to let them stand as his final word. And in doing that, he gave me something far more valuable than 60% of an estate. He gave me back the truth of who I really was. Not the woman my brother's lie had turned me into in his eyes, but simply, quietly, the daughter who had once dared to choose love over approval, and who deserved so much better than 15 years of unearned silence. In the months that followed, once the security cameras came down and the threats finally, mercifully stopped, I used part of that inheritance to start something I never expected to build. A small foundation, established in my father's name, that helps estranged family members, particularly parents and adult children separated by pride, misunderstanding, or unresolved conflict, access family mediation and counseling before too many precious years slip away unspoken between them. Because if this entire ordeal taught me one thing above everything else, it's that silence never actually protects anyone. It only delays the reckoning, and sometimes, that reckoning arrives far too late for the people who needed the truth the most. Daniel is currently facing separate legal proceedings I won't go into detail about here, out of respect for an investigation that's still ongoing. We have not spoken since the trial ended, and honestly, I don't know if we ever will. Some betrayals cut too deep to simply forgive, because enough time has quietly passed. Rachel reached out to me once, tearfully, asking for a chance to explain herself, and I told her I needed time. Time I am still taking, because real forgiveness, genuine forgiveness, is never something you owe anyone on their own convenient schedule, but every single year now. On my birthday, there is a cake sitting on my counter with my name written across it in careful, deliberate icing, made by my own 2 hands. If no one else happens to remember, because I have finally learned something my father learned, far, far too late in his own life, that the people who truly love you never need a reminder, and that the truth, no matter how deeply it gets buried, has a strange, patient way of finding the light exactly when it's needed the most. If this story moved you even a little tonight, I want you to do 2 simple things for me. First, leave a comment down below and tell me honestly, have you ever uncovered a truth about your own family that changed everything you thought you knew to be true? I read every single comment, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as mine does. Second, If you believe there's someone in your life tonight who needs to hear this exact story, go ahead and share it with them right now. You genuinely never know whose silence is quietly waiting to finally be broken. This has been Legacy Whisper, and I will see you in the very next story.